Before I make my comments, I want to be perfectly clear. I'm not authorized, nor do I speak for Cal-OSHA, nor am I authorized to speak for the unions, which purport to represent the safety engineers and industrial hygienists who do the inspections. The opinions which follow are mine alone, and the facts can be checked by those with patience for such things. Workers have the right to expect on-site inspections conducted by qualified inspectors when they face hazardous conditions. They should have the right to inspectors who are not overly extended and buried in cases. But the state of California's government, run by the Democrats and Republicans, has presided over decades of under-resourcing and understaffing of Cal-OSHA. Because Cal-OSHA has been compromised, because OSHA itself is a compromise. It was a reform won by sustained class struggle of the trade unions. The government did not just say, you can have OSHA to oversee your workplaces. Workers had to fight for health and safety in the workplaces. So I speak out for building strong unions to fight for workers' interests. Unfortunately, most of us feel underrepresented by the union leaders whose strategic orientation is supporting the capitalist politicians. Rather than building militant unions that prepare for the class struggle and squarely call out the capitalist class war against labor, we need to resolve the structural problems of the state government. We have to reorganize the power relationship between the social classes. And that means we have to rebuild class struggle trade unions that fight for a revitalized labor movement and fight for a workers' party. Consider how the capitalist state maintains state agencies responsible for health and safety on the job. Last June, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, PEER, reported a 21% vacancy rate at Cal-OSHA. They reported that California has only one inspector for every 99,000 workers, a fraction of the ratio for Washington, which has one for 25,000, and in Oregon, which has one for 22,000. Now, I know for a fact that these inspectors are smart and well-trained. I know they are put in a solid 40 hours every week, often missing lunches and breaks, working late, because that's the job. And I'll tell you a fact. No one is that good that they can do the inspection job for 99,000 workers per inspector. Something has to give. On top of that PEER report, in a state we have 18.5 million workers who speak other languages, but we only have 28 Cal-OSHA inspectors who speak other languages. Our inspectors are required to use translation services, which slow down the process of inspections. And these numbers haven't changed much in the last few months, and we don't expect them to change very quickly. The division loses employees, it loses experience, and it loses the historic and institutional knowledge. And when it hires new employees, the onboarding process is fast-paced, it is extensive, and it's long in duration. But it takes almost 3 years to onboard a new inspector, presuming they come in with the requisite knowledge and skill set. For years, the director of the Department of Industrial Relations, the previous one, Christine Baker, was making common cause with a corrupt human resources department run by Janice Yapojanko, while the union tops and the bureaucrats turned a blind eye. Indeed, managers and the rank and file in the know lived in obsequious fear of the corrupt power block which poisoned the department and prevented hiring and filling of positions. The dysfunction of the department was made public in an audit 2 years ago, and there's no need to beat that drum here and now, except that the repercussions continue to afflict the organization, which emerged after the departure of the last director, ill-prepared and understaffed at the beginning of the pandemic. Today, the division, Cal-OSHA, is being crushed under the weight of hundreds of serious COVID illnesses and fatalities, and thousands of complaints from across general industry. The division is mandated to open inspections for serious occupational accidents, illnesses, and fatalities within certain jurisdictional guidelines. And it must also answer valid formal complaints. So managers have to triage, prioritizing serious illnesses, accidents, and fatalities for on-site inspections. Because of the sheer volume of complaints, the field inspectors are stuck at their desks for hours processing calls and using letters and phone calls to employers in lieu of on-site inspections. For the thousands of complaints, most of which are about COVID and the fear of potential exposure, inspectors in the district offices are stretched and pushed beyond their limits. They needed additional resources a year ago, 6 months ago. Yesterday would not have been soon enough. In the media and among politicians and public health experts, the COVID pandemic has been likened to a war. In fact, other speakers have made that mention. Emergencies have been declared. We've gotten updates, daily updates, weekly updates by the governors, by the mayors, by the CDC, by public health. Yet throughout the course of the pandemic, the governor never authorized to immediately emergency action to cut through the red tape and expedite the hiring of staff needed to do the job. If there were a flood, there would be thousands mobilized to fill sandbags. This is a flood. Where are the thousands needed to do the work? The ruling class, with their wealth, have privilege of space and money to self-isolate. But essential workers are being exposed in work sites and are not being served either by OSHA consultation or enforcement in a timely manner because we do not have the troops to put out in the field. The good employers struggle to understand and implement the emerging, changing guidelines and standards. The problematic employers give employees grief with little fear of oversight from the understaffed division. The governor has not reached out to the universities to provide the division with emergency and temporary assignment of the most promising young engineers and scientists to integrate them into the division on an emergency basis. He has not utilized the resources of the state to immediately bolster Cal-OSHA because he represents the capitalist class, not the working class. Only a workers' government can ensure a robust, healthy, and safety for workers on the job. That's why we're campaigning for labor to break from the Democrats and build a fighting workers' labor party. We have to ask, who should be enforcing the ATD standard? That's the aerosol transmissible disease standard. The governor did not mobilize retired medical professionals and have them onboarded and deputized and put in the field to consult and to enforce the very complex aerosol transmissible disease standard in the hospitals, the skilled nursing homes, the prisons, and the other congregate settings. Their expertise was left at home in lockdown. The ATD standard is not only very complex, it has very little history of enforcement. In normal times, the hazards addressed by that standard present in a manageable fashion in the healthcare setting. But today, essential workers want to know, why weren't these experts deputized? The National Guard has medical professionals whose knowledge could have been put to work by the division. Where's the National Guard? This is a health standard, and most of the inspectors are safety engineers, not industrial hygienists. Most of the inspectors who are enforcing it today never read the ATD standard until their first case within the last year. The history of underfunding science in state service is catching up with us now, and this is something I know a little bit about. I was a state scientist for 10 years before becoming an engineer at Cal-OSHA for the last 5. The 20-plus-year-old disparity between the engineers' and scientists' salaries has not been resolved. Hence, On top of being under-resourced, the division is woefully understaffed on the health side, meaning the division hires safety engineers and industrial hygienists, but cannot retain the industrial hygienists because they do not, they do the same and even more complex work for less money. Let's face it, the boss's political machine that created Newsom never planned for him to be a real innovative leader. They wanted and got a tool to enforce the will of the billionaire class, and to never miss an opportunity to take back from the public workers he sits across from at the bargaining table for state employees. What did the governor do in the 2020 contract? With the sad rhetoric of, we are all in this together, and with not an audible peep from the unions, contracts were signed which cut state workers' pay by approximately 9.4% for 2 years. That's equivalent to 2 days of furlough a month. Then, faced with the crunch of work, he had to beg hundreds of workers to come back to work on overtime to fill up the EDD slots and give overtime for the overworked inspectors doing the COVID cases. In 2009, the Schwarzenegger response to the recession was to apply 72 days of furlough to state workers. In response, some state workers' unions negotiated no furlough clauses into their contracts, only to capitulate in 2020, accepting the equivalent of a furlough. While employees have the right to take those 2 days off a month, the essential work at Cal-OSHA are under such pressure from their case lapse time that they work right through those 2 days under promise to pick them up as CTO in the future. The 2021 budget provides for close to 180 new inspectors, far from the 1,000 or more that we need. But there are caveats and hoops to be jumped through before they're hired. And even with managers working around the clock to evaluate candidates, they will be hired and onboarded in time. They won't be hired and onboarded in time to support the pandemic response. Even with the 180 new inspectors, the division will not come close to the ratio in Oregon and Washington. So we face a myriad of problems here. I talked about the corruption at HR itself and the symptoms, but those are symptoms. They're not the source of the problem. I talked about the decades of the old chronic understaffing, and that's a symptom of the problem, but it's not the source of the problem. We talked about the understaffing that precipitated a culture of inspections driven more by the pressure to satisfy observable metrics than what lay beneath the surface at the inspection sites. And that's a consequence, but not the source of the problem. And the 20-year-old disparity between the industrial hygienists and the salary of the safety engineers still undercutting the division's ability to recruit and retain industrial hygienists is a consequence, but not the source of the problem. Indeed, it's essential to understand that OSHA as an organization was an essential gain of the working class's struggle, and to make it functional, we need to struggle as a class. We need to take direct action. We need to take strike action. We're taught in 10th grade civics class that the state is class neutral, that it stands above social divisions, that it's a neutral arbiter. But that's not the truth of it. If it were, we would see real health and safety. You don't have to look any further than your tax code to see which class writes the laws and legislation. At every step, the employer class challenges health and safety regulations as they're proposed, written, legislated, promulgated, enforced, and adjudicated. They do not do this out of malaise or hatred of the workers. They do this under pressure of the shareholders for tangible, regular, predictable profit. Any animosity, intimidation, alienation of social relations between labor and management are the result of management's obligation to suck labor dry as it confronts each worker's obligation to go home safely and healthy to their families at the end of the day. That's the class conflict that we face every day on every job site. How does the ruling capitalist class collude with the leaders of labor management against the interests of the workers? I'm talking about what's happening with CAPS and PEGs, the engineers and scientists, as I try to wrap this up. Blanning & Baker is a for-profit corporation which runs 2 company unions, CAPS for the scientists and PEGs for the engineers. A company union is a union which cuts its deals with management against the interests of the rank and file and against the interests of the working class as a whole. Now, Blanning & Baker organized CAPS and PEGs, and for decades, Blanning & Baker have led them while also acting as the executive director of the Young Democrats of California, a political arm of California's political machine. While Blanning & Baker was able to deliver on bread and butter issues for PEG, it cut a Faustian deal, and that was to sacrifice the smaller bargaining units of the other unions. PEG and CAPS contracts were used as a battering ram against SEIU and other unions. PEG and CAPS represent a relatively uninterested layer of the labor aristocracy, which does not take much interest in their union. That's why they're able to be rolled over without regular meetings, why they're able to have hand-picked union representatives that meet the needs of the executive director, not the rank and file. And so the membership is kept in the blind. And the membership accepted the takeaways which former Governor Brown wanted to enforce on all 250,000 state workers during the 2015 bargaining period. This is a little complex, and thank you for bearing with me, but it's important for the interests of the working class to see how the unions operate with the political class of the capitalists, the Democrats and Republicans, and stand as a block against our advancing the interests of our class. Ultimately, the 16,000 scientists and engineers, mostly without even knowing it, signed off on these takebacks in the form of a payroll check-off contribution to pension medical insurance funds. Why? Because the capitalist politicians and Governor Brown wanted to ensure the for-profit medical and insurance companies can raise their premiums annually. And instead of looking to the 120-plus billionaires in the state of California, the governor went after the workers themselves, requiring a checkoff, which Blanning & Baker pushed through. And then SEIU followed suit, and the checkoff was enforced. And then it incrementally grew year after year. And workers are looking at their checks going, why it started at $30, is it now $80 or $100 every month? So we need more inspectors. Do we need the same ratios as Washington and Oregon? Do we need 1,000 inspectors? Is 1,000 even enough? I don't know. But I do know that if I had 10 new hires in my office tomorrow, I could keep them busy, very busy, fulfilling the mandate of the division. If the capitalist politicians had intended Cal-OSHA to be fully staffed and capable of meeting its mandate, they would have been by now. So the governor assigned new chiefs and directors with impeccable credentials and resumes after the debacle that was exposed in the audit. And they may have had the best intentions, but even they are constrained by the class nature of the state, which is far from being a neutral arbiter. So opposed to the capitalist state government, which pretends to be class neutral, but underserves the people, we need a workers' government which makes no claim to class neutrality. To enforce health and safety in the workplace and to build robust health and safety enforcement, workers need their own fighting workers' party. Such a party can only be built by the ranks of labor taking up class struggle tactics of strikes and direct action to build workers' power in the workplaces and in the streets, and with a strategy of political independence, of breaking from the Democratic Party and running labor candidates. Our labor candidates must run campaigns that are used to organize and mobilize the labor movement and the movements of the especially oppressed people to fight for transitional demands that chart a path from the basic needs, such as safety and health on the job and jobs for all, through massive public works programs to 30 hours work for 40 hours pay, housing for the unhoused, health care for the people, not for profit, free quality education from preschool to graduate school, and pensions. generations, straight through class struggle and political independence to the nationalization under workers' control of the commanding heights of the economy and the democratic planning of production needed to build a healthy future. Thank you, sisters, brothers, co-workers, and friends.